Breathless and sick with fear, Rosalind slammed her whole palm against the elevator button. Behind her, down the cold stone corridor of the Linden Hotel, footsteps echoed steady and unhurried. He was coming. The steel doors slid open, and Rosalind threw herself inside, fleeing a monster. But as the doors crashed shut, she realized in horror that she had just locked herself in with someone far more terrifying. Her lungs burned. Rosalind had just torn down the length of the penthouse corridor, the laughter of the charity gala falling away behind her, the clink of crystal glasses, the low murmur of Chicago's elite, a soft strain of piano. It all dissolved into a distant ringing. The only things she could still hear were the frantic pounding of her own heart and the heavy footsteps of the man hunting her. Preston Vance did not need to run. He had never needed to run. Minutes earlier, he had seized her wrist in the middle of the ballroom, his fingers clamping down hard enough that she knew by morning there would be a ring of bruises beneath the sleeve of her uniform. "Who do you think you are, spilling wine on me?" he hissed through his teeth, his breath reeking of hard liquor. She had done no such thing. The tray had only tipped when he yanked at her arm. But in rooms like these, the word of a man like him always carried further than the word of someone who served the drinks. She drove her heel down onto the top of his foot and ran. Rosalind risked a glance over her shoulder. The corridor was empty for a single heartbeat, but she knew he would cut through the cigar lounge to head her off. He was not chasing her. He was cornering her. At the far end of the hall, tucked into an alcove, few people noticed, stood a private elevator, its small brass plate reading only penthouse and parking garage. She did not care where it went, so long as it went down. She lunged for it, her trembling fingers crushing the call button. Come on," she whispered, her voice cracking. Some 30 meters away, Preston's broad silhouette appeared at the corner, his suit jacket open, his face flushed with a cold, frightening fury. His eyes locked onto hers, and a triumphant smile curled at the edge of his mouth. He quickened his stride. A chime. The steel doors slid open. Rosalind did not look back. She simply hurled herself into the wood-paneled car and jabbed at the button for the garage. "Carter!" Preston's voice rang off the stone walls. He surged forward, stretching his hand toward her. Rosalind pressed herself into the corner of the elevator, held her breath, and prayed to a higher power she had not spoken to in years. The doors closed with maddening slowness. Preston's fingertips had just grazed the edge of the frame when the heavy doors slammed together. Rosalind sank down, her back sliding along the wooden wall until she sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. Safe, at least for the next 60 seconds. "You're scuffing the leather of my shoes." The voice was low, resonant, and utterly without panic. It did not belong to Preston, nor did it sound like any waiter she had ever heard. Rosalind's head snapped up. She edged backward until her spine met the opposite wall, her wide eyes adjusting to the dim amber light of the car. She was not alone. Leaning into the corner with insolent calm stood a tall man. His dark tailored suit fitted close to broad shoulders, but it was his eyes that froze the blood in her veins, a cold, piercing gray, regarding her from above with the indifference of someone long accustomed to watching prey struggle. And in that moment, Rosalind understood, with an entirely new kind of fear, that she had escaped a bully only to fall straight into the den of a real wolf. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow Rosalind's journey all the way through. The man didn't move. He didn't reach out to help her up, didn't step toward her, only stood there watching her the way someone might watch a fledgling fallen from its nest, with curiosity and indifference tangled together. The yellow light inside the elevator car cast hard lines across his face, a sharp jaw, a straight nose, features cut with a severity that made him seem carved rather than born. Rosalind swallowed dryly, forcing her voice not to tremble. She stammered an apology, saying she hadn't known anyone was in here, that it was an emergency. He tilted his head slightly and answered in an even voice that he could see that much for himself. His gaze drifted down to her bare feet, to the shoes she had abandoned somewhere in the hallway, then stopped at her wrist, where Preston's fingers had left a faint purple ring. He said that usually, when a woman rushed into his private elevator, she ought to have the courtesy to introduce herself. His private elevator. Those 4 words made Rosalind's mind spin. She glanced at the control panel. There were no buttons for the main lobby or the ballroom floors, only the penthouse, the ground floor, and several basement levels. Without meaning to, she had charged straight into the private space of one of the hotel's most important guests. She answered, her voice still unsteady. that her name was Rosalind Carter, and asked him to let her out at the basement level. She wouldn't bother him for even one more second. The man lifted one eyebrow slightly. He repeated her last name in his mouth as though tasting some unfamiliar wine, then said Carter was a common name, but the man who had just chased her halfway across the penthouse wasn't common at all. That was Preston Vance. Rosalind's breath caught. She asked how he knew that. He replied with a calmness so cold it chilled her, saying that knowing who moved in and out of his buildings was his job. A shiver ran down her spine. His buildings, the Linden Hotel, belonged to a discreet corporation that everyone in Chicago's upper circles quietly understood was a front for powers no one dared to name, and the man standing less than an arm's length from her was the shadow behind that front. The newspapers called him an investor. The police called him by another name, one spoken with far more caution: Sloane Ashford. She had heard that name whispered in restaurant kitchens, in stories people swallowed in a hurry whenever they saw her pass by. People said he could bring a business to ruin in a single morning, and make a person disappear even faster than that. Rosalind backed against the steel doors behind her. She had just escaped a bully dressed in the costume of a gentleman, only to lock herself inside a metal box with a man even the powerful treated with care. The corner of Sloane's mouth lifted into a faint, unreadable smile at the exact moment he realized she understood who she was standing before. He lowered his voice by a shade and told her to stay calm, that he didn't make a habit of disturbing the leather lining in his elevator, and blood was very difficult to clean out of walnut wood. The sentence hung between mockery and threat, sending a coldness over the back of her neck. He took a single step forward, just enough for the light to reveal the bruise around her wrist more clearly. He looked at it for a long while, longer than necessary, then said softly that Vance always left marks. He had never learned how to control his hands. There wasn't a trace of pity in his voice, only a cold recognition, as though he had seen marks like that far too many times before. Rosalind tightened her sleeve over the bruise, but he had already seen everything. She asked, almost without sound, why a man like him would care. Sloane was silent for a moment. The floor number on the small screen above the doors kept falling quietly. He said he didn't care. He only hated carelessness, and men like Vance were the worst kind of careless. They believed money could buy them the right to trample other people without paying a price. He said it lightly, as if making a remark about the weather, but in the depths of his gray eyes, something flashed and then vanished, something Rosalind couldn't name. She only knew that, for the first time since she had set foot in this building, the fear inside her began to give way to a question she didn't dare ask. The elevator gave a faint shudder and came to a stop, the number on the small screen holding still on the basement level. Rosalind held her breath as the two steel doors began to part, and what appeared before her wasn't the escape she had been hoping for. Beneath the cold white lights of the underground parking garage, 3 broad, powerfully built men stood in a curved line, blocking the way out, dressed in black suits, shoulders wide, their sharp, icy eyes locked straight onto her. She recognized one of them, the man who had stood behind Preston throughout the party like a shadow. Preston truly wasn't stupid. He had called men to cut off her path the moment she disappeared from the penthouse. Rosalind backed up half a step, her spine touching the familiar wooden wall again, and in that instant she felt desperately small, like an animal driven into the very last corner of a dead end. The man in front curled his mouth and told her to come with them like a good girl. Mr. Vance only wanted to talk things through, but then his eyes lifted from her, sweeping deeper into the elevator car, and all 3 men froze for a split second. Sloane stepped out of the darkness behind Rosalind, slow and unhurried, his hand still tucked in his trouser pocket, as though he were strolling through his own living room. He didn't speak right away. He only looked at the 3 men, one by one, with gray eyes so flat and still they were almost frightening. And the change happened so quickly that Rosalind almost didn't recognize it in time. The man in front, the one who had been smirking just moments earlier, suddenly straightened like a schoolboy caught doing something wrong. The aggression drained from his face, replaced by something she had never seen anyone give to a man who was merely standing still and saying nothing. Fear. Sloane spoke, his voice no louder than before, still low, still even. But each word dropped into the empty garage like a heavy stone. He asked whether any of them had forgotten whose ground they were standing on. No one answered. He went on, saying that this girl had stepped into his elevator, which meant that from that second on, she was his guest, and he had never heard that Preston Vance had the right to block a guest inside his own building. The man in front opened his mouth, about to explain something about Mr. Vance's orders, but Sloane only tilted his head slightly, and that small movement was enough to make the words die in the man's throat. He took his phone from his jacket pocket, dialed a number, lifted it to his ear, and during the entire time, he waited for the other end to answer. No one in the garage dared to move. When someone picked up, Sloane said only a few brief sentences. Remind Mr. Vance who holds the lease on his entire eastern block, and if these 3 men were still inside his building in 5 minutes, by tomorrow morning, a few things in Vance's life would change in ways he wouldn't like at all. He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and looked at the 3 men with the eyes of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. They didn't wait for him to repeat himself. The man in front lowered his head, mumbled an apology Rosalind couldn't quite hear, and then all 3 turned and retreated toward the garage exit, walking like men who had just realized they had stepped into the territory of a far greater force. Rosalind stood there, her heart still pounding, but this time for a different reason. She had just watched a man dissolve an entire threat without lifting a finger, without raising his voice, without a single act of violence, using only his name and the weight behind that name. It was a kind of power she had never seen with her own eyes before. A power that didn't need display because it had nothing to prove. Sloane turned to her, and for the first time, his gaze softened a little, if only barely. He said she now had 2 choices. One was to leave this place safely with him. The other was to stay and deal with Preston on her own when he came down here, and he would leave the decision to her, because in his opinion, a woman who had just dared to crush Vance's foot beneath her heel in the middle of a party surely had enough nerve to choose her own next path. Rosalind stood motionless for a while in the empty parking garage, weighing the 2 roads laid before her. Then she thought of Preston's face, red with rage, and of the fingers that had tightened around her wrist, and she understood that staying would be the same as handing herself over. She followed Sloane, though every step was cautious, as if she were setting her foot onto thin ice. A glossy black car was already waiting by the basement exit. The driver opened the door without saying a word, and when Rosalind sat inside the quiet, spacious cabin, she still kept as much distance as possible from the man seated across from her. The car rolled smoothly out of the basement and merged into the nightlights of Chicago. She clenched her hands tightly in her lap, and at last she asked the question that had been circling in her mind since the moment the elevator doors closed. Why would he do all this for someone he didn't even know? Sloane looked out through the window for a while, the streetlights flashing across his face in pale streaks, then answered that she shouldn't misunderstand. He wasn't doing this for her. At least not yet. The answer was so blunt that Rosalind didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. He went on, his voice still even, saying there was one kind of person in this world he couldn't stand, the kind who believed that because they had a little money and a little power in their hands, they were allowed to trample anyone weaker than themselves, and Preston Vance was the perfect embodiment of that kind of man. He said men like Vance moved through other people's lives as if they were walking across a carpet, stepping on them and forgetting them at once, certain that no one would ever be strong enough to make them stop. Rosalind listened in silence. She realized that in that cold voice there was none of ordinary kindness, none of the pity people often offered the unfortunate, only a sharp, decisive contempt for the oppressor. She asked about the Linden Hotel, whether he truly owned it, and Sloane's mouth lifted faintly as he said the name on the paperwork belonged to a company no one bothered to investigate, but every brick in that building, every doorman, every server carrying trays of wine tonight, including her, was standing on his ground. He didn't say it to boast, but as if stating an obvious truth, and it was that very calmness that made Rosalind's skin prickle, because a person was only truly calm about his power when he had never had to doubt it. She looked at him, trying to read something behind that composed outer shell, but his face was closed like a door that had been locked for a long time. She said she was grateful that he had helped her get out of the parking garage, but she didn't need a savior. She only needed to go home, because someone was waiting for her there. Sloane tilted his head and looked at her with a brief flicker of curiosity when he heard her say someone was waiting, but he didn't ask more. He only said he would have someone take her home, and that she should understand one thing. Tonight, Preston Vance had been humiliated in front of his own people, and a man like him never swallowed humiliation quietly. Rosalind felt the chill return, because she knew he was right. She had seen Preston's eyes around the bend of the hallway, the eyes of a man unused to being refused. She asked what she was supposed to do, and this time Sloane didn't answer at once. He only looked at her for a long while, as if weighing how much more effort she was worth. then said she should go home and rest tonight. Everything else could be dealt with tomorrow, and she would be surprised to learn how many things one night could change. The car stopped at the end of the street where she lived. Rosalind stepped out, and when the car door closed behind her, she looked back at the black car as it silently blended into the darkness. Her heart tangled between relief that she was safe and the vague instinct that her life had just turned onto a bend she couldn't yet imagine. Rosalind climbed 4 flights of stairs because the elevator in the old apartment building had been broken since the previous winter, and no one had bothered to fix it. Her steps felt heavy after a long night that seemed to have stretched across an entire lifetime. But when she stood before the door of her small apartment and heard the soft murmur of the television slipping through the crack, something inside her eased. She slid the key into the lock, pushed the door open, and found Daisy curled up on the worn old sofa with a plaid blanket wrapped around her body, her eyes drooping with sleep, though she was still trying to stay awake and wait for her sister to come home. The little girl sprang up the moment she saw her, her 12-year-old face lighting with a smile that made all the exhaustion in Rosalind's body melt away. Daisy gently scolded her for coming home so late, saying she had meant to stay awake until Rosalind got back before she would go to bed. And Rosalind laughed softly, straightening the blanket around her sister's shoulders, as she told her that a little girl ought to be dreaming sweet dreams by now. Daisy shook her head hard and said she had waited because there was something she wanted to show her. Then she ran into the corner of the room, rummaged through her stack of drawing paper, and pulled out a picture that still smelled of crayons. It showed the 2 sisters standing hand in hand in front of a house with a chimney and a garden full of flowers, the sky colored in all kinds of bright shades that only a child's imagination would dare put together. Daisy pointed to the house, excitedly telling her that this was the house where the 2 of them would live someday, with a very big yard where she could plant sunflowers, and Rosalind sat down beside her, looking at the drawing for a long time, her throat tightening with an emotion that was both warm and painfully sharp. She gathered her sister into her arms, kissed the girl's tangled hair, and promised that one day the 2 of them would surely have a house like that, with a sunflower garden too. She didn't say aloud what was weighing on her heart, that to have even a small piece of that dream, she first had to take care of her sister's heart. Daisy had been born with a heart that wasn't as healthy as other children's, and the doctors had said long ago that she needed surgery, and the cost of that surgery was a number that made Rosalind feel small every time she thought about it. That was why she worked 2 shifts every day, the morning shift at a cafe near home, and the evening shift at elegant parties like the one tonight, saving every dollar in tips, every bit of her modest wages, hiding it all in a tin box behind the kitchen cabinet, without Daisy knowing. She had never let her sister see the worry on her face, never let the little girl feel the weight she was carrying, because she wanted Daisy's childhood to be filled with drawings and dreams, not numbers and the fears of grown people. Daisy yawned widely, rubbed her head against her sister's shoulder, and whispered a question about whether there had been anything fun at the party that day. Rosalind, remembering everything she had just endured that night, only smiled and told her about the glittering crystal chandeliers and the pretty little pastries, keeping hidden the terror in the penthouse hallway, and the man with gray eyes inside the elevator. She carried Daisy to bed, pulled the blanket over her, and stayed sitting on the edge of the mattress until the little girl's breathing became steady in sleep. Then she stepped back into the front room, sat down at the wobbly dining table, took out the tin box, and counted the money inside beneath the weak yellow light. And though she had worked herself to the edge of exhaustion, that number was still far too distant from the goal she needed to reach. She buried her face in her hands for a while, not crying, only drawing in one deep breath. Then she put the box back where it belonged and told herself that tomorrow she would keep going, just as she always had, because her little sister was all she had left in the world. The next morning, Rosalind woke before the sky had even begun to lighten, made breakfast for Daisy, reminded her to be good at home, then hurried to the cafe in time for her morning shift. The unease from the night before still clung to her heart, but she tried to push it aside so she could focus on work. Yet she had barely stepped through the cafe door, hadn't even had time to tie the apron around herself, when the manager called her inside, his face awkward in the way of a man about to say something he didn't want to say. He avoided looking directly into her eyes, circling around vague explanations about cutting staff and difficult business conditions. But Rosalind had worked there long enough to know that the cafe was never short of customers in the morning, and she understood there was another reason hidden behind those evasive words. She calmly asked him outright whether she had done something wrong, and the manager sighed, finally lowering his voice and admitting that he had received a call that morning from someone he couldn't afford to offend. and that person had made it clear that as long as Rosalind Carter continued working there, the cafe would run into all kinds of trouble, from business licenses to sudden inspections. He said he was sorry, that he had a family to take care of too, that he had no other choice. Rosalind stood still, and though no name was mentioned, she knew exactly whose hand was pulling the strings behind it all. Preston Vance hadn't forgotten last night's humiliation, and this was how he struck back. Not with a fist, but with a phone call, quietly pulling away the last places of support beneath her feet. She took off the apron, folded it neatly, set it on the counter, thanked the manager in a voice so calm it surprised even herself, then walked out of the cafe into the morning sunlight that was still cold. She walked for a long stretch without knowing where she was going, feeling only the emptiness in her head and the pressure in her chest, as if an invisible hand were squeezing the breath out of her. Losing the morning shift meant losing nearly half her income, and after the way Preston had moved against her last night, she knew the evening parties might soon close their doors to her too, because the city's event service world was smaller than people imagined, and one word from a man like him could have her name crossed off every list. She thought of the tin box hidden behind the kitchen cabinet, of the number still so far from the goal, of Daisy's small heart waiting for a surgery that grew more urgent with every passing day, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt her legs wanting to buckle right there in the middle of the sidewalk. She found a bench in a nearby park, dropped down onto it, and let despair rise inside her for a few minutes. Only a few minutes. She allowed herself to be weak in that exact moment. But then, she thought of Daisy's radiant face as she showed her the drawing of the house with the sunflower garden. She thought of the promise she had whispered beside her sister's bed the night before, and something hard inside her refused to collapse. She quickly wiped the corners of her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and told herself she had survived days darker than this, that she would find a way, whatever it took. She rose from the bench, and at that very moment, the old phone in her pocket vibrated. A message from an unfamiliar number, saved under no name, only a single line of words that made her whole body go cold, saying that some debts couldn't be paid with money, and that she should be more careful walking alone through the streets. Rosalind snapped her head up, her eyes sweeping around the empty park, and for the first time, she felt with terrible clarity that Preston Vance's retaliation had only just begun. Rosalind had barely had time to steady herself after that chilling message, when a familiar black car silently pulled up to the curb beside the park, and she recognized it at once as the car that had taken her home the night before. The window lowered, revealing Sloane Ashford's composed face, and he said, in that deep, even voice with no trace of surprise, that it seemed she was having a rather unpleasant morning. Rosalind tightened her grip on the phone in her hand, both wary and bewildered, and asked how he always managed to appear at the exact moment she was in trouble. Sloane only replied that he had already told her. Knowing what was happening in this city was his job. He opened the car door and invited her to sit inside and talk for a moment, saying he didn't make a habit of discussing important matters through a car window in the middle of the street. Rosalind hesitated, but thinking of the threatening message she had just received, she realized sitting inside the car might be safer than standing alone on an empty sidewalk, so she climbed in, still keeping her distance as she had before. Sloane went straight to the point. He said he knew she had lost her job that morning, and that it was only the first blow. Preston Vance wouldn't stop until he saw her completely broken, because to a man like him, a server daring to defy him in public was a stain he couldn't endure. Then, he made his offer. He wanted her to work for him, in a position inside his office, with a salary many times higher than anything she had ever earned, and more importantly, under his protection, Preston wouldn't be able to touch her again. Rosalind shook her head almost at once, her pride flaring up inside her. She said she didn't need anyone's pity, that she had been used to managing on her own for years and would keep doing so, that she didn't want to owe a debt to a man whose true nature she didn't even understand. She said she wasn't the kind of person who clung to the shelter of the powerful in exchange for peace, and she placed her hand on the car door, about to step out. But Sloane only added one calm sentence, saying he thought Daisy deserved the healthy heart she was waiting for. Rosalind froze, her hand on the door suddenly going rigid. She turned sharply to look at him, the blood in her veins seeming to harden, and asked in a trembling voice filled with both fear and anger how he knew about her sister, and how he dared drag the child into this. Sloane didn't flinch. He said he wasn't dragging the child into anything. He had only looked into the person he intended to help. That was his principle, and he knew about Daisy's heart condition, knew about the surgery Rosalind was scraping together every dollar for, knew about the tin box and the amount still far beyond reach. He didn't say it as a threat, but in a strangely steady voice, as though he were placing on the table a truth they both already understood. Rosalind sat there stunned, her heart torn by a storm of tangled conflict. One part of her still cried out that she couldn't trust a dangerous man like this, that every offer too generous always carried a hidden price behind it. But another part, the part of the older sister who had stayed awake through so many nights worrying for the child, thought of Daisy's radiant face, of the small heart waiting day after day, of the cruel truth that if she kept clinging to her pride, the one who would pay the price wouldn't be her, but Daisy. She closed her eyes for a moment, struggling with herself, then opened them and told Sloane she needed to make one thing clear. She wasn't doing this because she was afraid of Preston, nor because she was drawn to his power. She was doing it for her sister, and only for her sister. And if she found out he had any other intention, she wouldn't hesitate to walk away. Sloane looked at her for a long while, and this time, in his gray eyes, something passed that almost resembled respect. He gave a slight nod and said he expected nothing less. Less than a week after Rosalind agreed to work for Sloane, a phone call from one of the largest hospitals in Chicago changed everything. The woman on the other end introduced herself as the coordinator from the cardiology department and informed her that Daisy's case had been placed on the priority surgery list, and that every cost, from the operation itself to the days of recovery in the hospital, had been fully paid by an anonymous benefactor. Rosalind stood frozen in the small apartment, the phone trembling in her hand. She asked again and again whether there had been some mistake, how something like this could possibly happen, but the woman only gently confirmed that all the paperwork had been completed, and the family only needed to bring the little girl in for the necessary tests. When Rosalind set the phone down, she had to grip the back of a chair to keep herself from collapsing. So many years of saving every dollar, so many sleepless nights, heavy with fear, had suddenly been untied in a phone call that lasted only a few minutes, and the feeling was so enormous that she didn't know where to place it inside her chest. Deep down, she knew exactly whose hand stood behind that gift. No name had been mentioned, but she understood that only one person who had just entered her life possessed enough power and enough discretion to do such a thing without needing anyone to know. Yet when she tried to ask Sloane, he only looked at her with calm gray eyes and said he didn't understand what she was talking about, that perhaps there were still good things in this world that found their own way to people who deserved them. He denied it so smoothly that Rosalind couldn't force him to admit anything, and that quietness itself made her throat tighten in a way that boastful words never could. On the day Daisy was taken in for surgery, Rosalind sat outside for hours, her hands locked tightly together, and when the doctor came out with a smile and told her everything had gone well, that the little girl's small heart could now beat with strong, healthy rhythms, Rosalind broke down crying. For the first time in a very long while, she let her tears fall not from despair, but from a happiness too great to hold back. The days that followed were the brightest days the two sisters had ever known in that sun-filled hospital room. Daisy recovered so quickly that even the nurses were surprised. The little girl asked for paper and pencils as soon as she was strong enough to sit up, and once again, she drew with deep concentration. This time, it was a large red heart with white wings, flying upward through a blue sky. She proudly told her sister that it was her new heart, a heart that knew how to fly, and Rosalind laughed until the corners of her eyes stung. She held Daisy very gently in her arms, feeling the steady, healthy beat beneath that small rib cage, a rhythm she had spent so long fearing might one day grow weaker and fade. Daisy asked her who the kind person was who had helped her get better, because she wanted to draw that person a picture to say thank you, and Rosalind sat quietly for a moment, not knowing how to answer. In the end, she only stroked Daisy's hair and said it was someone very special, someone who perhaps didn't like being thanked, but if Daisy drew a truly beautiful picture, then maybe one day that person would receive it. That night, after Daisy had fallen deeply asleep in the peaceful rest of a child no longer threatened by illness, Rosalind stood by the window of the hospital room, looking out at the city glittering with lights, and she thought about Sloane Ashford, about the cold, ruthless man the entire city treated with caution, the man who had quietly given her little sister a new life without asking for even a word of thanks. And for the first time, she wondered whether she truly understood the person hidden behind those gray eyes at all. After Daisy was discharged from the hospital and returned home with a new life in her body, Rosalind began her days working in Sloane's office, and the more time she spent near him, the more he seemed like a riddle with no answer. A man who could make an entire corporation tremble with a single phone call, yet quietly pay the hospital bills of a child he didn't know, without needing anyone to find out. Late one evening, when the two of them were still in the office high above the city, looking down over Chicago, Rosalind gathered the courage to ask him why a man like him hated those who bullied the weak so deeply, hated them so much that it had become a rule he lived by. Sloan was silent for a very long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he poured himself a glass of whiskey, stood beside the window, and began to speak in a low, rough voice she had never heard from him before. He told her he hadn't been born into silk and privilege the way people like to claim, that he had grown up in a poor working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city, in an apartment even worse than the one she lived in, where his mother worked herself to exhaustion in a garment factory to support the two of them. He told her that when he was 10 years old, that factory belonged to a wealthy owner who was used to treating workers like weeds under his feet, and when Sloane's mother fell ill after years of laboring in toxic conditions, that owner not only refused to pay a single dollar toward her treatment, but also threw her out onto the street, simply because she had dared to speak up for her rights. Sloane's voice stayed even, but every word seemed to hold something that had been frozen inside him for many years. He said he had watched his mother knock on door after door, begging for help, had watched her be driven away by people with money and power, while not one of them stopped to listen, and that she had died when he was still too young to do anything except stand there and look on helplessly. He said his mother's death wasn't caused by illness, but by the indifference of those who believed a poor woman's life wasn't worth as much as a line of expense in their ledgers. Rosalind listened with her heart tightening, and she began to understand why those gray eyes were always so cold, and why they softened whenever they turned toward people who had no one to protect them. Sloane went on, saying that from that day forward, he had sworn one thing to himself, that he would never again let himself fall into a position so weak that he had to hold out his hand and beg for mercy from anyone else, and that he would climb high enough so no powerful man could ever trample him, or the people he wanted to protect. He said he had built everything he had with his own hands, and through paths people didn't dare to name, and though the way he had climbed to the top hadn't always been clean, there was one line he had never crossed. He never crushed anyone weaker than himself, because he understood too well what it felt like to stand at the bottom and have the whole world turn away. He turned back to look at her and said that when he saw the bruise on her wrist in the elevator that night, he hadn't seen a strange woman. He had seen the shadow of his mother from years ago, had seen all the people who had been ground down simply because they didn't have enough strength to fight back. Rosalind went still. She realized that behind the ruthless shell that made the whole city afraid was a wound that had never healed, and that the help he had given her and Daisy hadn't been pity as she had once thought, but the way a wounded man tried to save the part of his own past that he had been unable to save. She said softly that she was very sorry for what he had gone through, and Sloane only shook his head slightly, replying that he hadn't told her so she would pity him, but so she would understand that the war with Preston Vance, for him, had never been only about her. The story of Sloane's past haunted Rosalind for many days afterward, and one weekend afternoon, while Daisy was happily coloring by the window, she decided to clean out the old cabinet in the corner of the room, where she had kept the things that belonged to her parents, things she had never had enough courage to open since the day her father died. Her father had passed away a few years earlier, when Daisy had been too little to remember his face, in an accident at the construction site where he worked as a laborer, and all this time Rosalind had always believed it was only an unfortunate workplace accident, one of countless risks that manual workers like her father had to face every day. She pulled out a cardboard box with frayed edges. Inside were old yellowed papers, a few family photographs, her father's wristwatch that had stopped running, and a stack of documents related to the accident, documents she had been too young and too grief-stricken back then to read carefully. She sat down on the floor, turning page after page beneath the pale afternoon light, reading the accident report again, the letters from the company, the notice of the small compensation payment the family had received after his death. Then her eyes stopped at the bottom of one page, where the name of the project's developer was written, a name that until a few weeks ago she had never paid any attention to. But now, when she saw it, her whole body seemed to turn to stone. Preston Vance's Corporation. Rosalind read that line again and again, telling herself there had to be some coincidence, that this city was enormous, and there were countless real estate corporations. But that name kept striking her eyes, bold and clear in a way she couldn't deny. The construction site where her father had fallen belonged to the very corporation of the man who had chased her through the hotel hallway, the man who had gripped her wrist hard enough to bruise it, the man who had just quietly torn away her job and threatened her life. A cold feeling crawled down Rosalind's spine. Not fear, but a vague and aching instinct, as if some invisible thread had just been pulled tight, tying the past to the present, a thread whose shape she still couldn't see but whose weight she could already feel. She turned through the remaining pages more quickly, searching for something she herself didn't even know, and the more she read, the more she sensed that something was wrong. The wording in the report was too brief, too general, as though someone had deliberately written it carelessly in order to close the matter as quickly as possible. She dimly remembered that back then, there had also been a few other workers whispering about her father's death. Murmurs she had ignored because at the time she had only been a young girl, stunned silent by loss, scrambling just to survive from day to day and raise her baby sister. Now, sitting amid the pile of old papers, for the first time in years, she wondered whether her father's death had truly been as simple as what people had told her. She looked up toward Daisy, who was bent over her coloring, the little girl's face peaceful and radiant beneath the sunlight, and Rosalind carefully gathered the documents together, not wanting her sister to see the unease rising inside her. That night, Rosalind couldn't fall asleep at all. The name Preston Vance kept circling through her mind, weaving itself together with Sloane's words that the war with Vance had never been only about her, and she began to suspect that perhaps between her and that enemy, there existed a far deeper connection than a chance collision at a party. A connection buried beneath the dust of time, one she would have to dig into the light herself. The next morning, Rosalind brought the stack of old documents to Sloane, placed them on his desk, and said she needed him to help her find the truth, because she couldn't keep living with an unanswered question buried in her heart about her father's death. Sloane turned through each page, his eyes stopping on the name Preston Vance, and she saw his jaw tighten, a shadow passing for an instant through his gray eyes. He said he would have his people look into it, that with the connections and the hidden paths he held in his hands, no truth could stay buried forever. Within only a few days, Sloane's people uncovered the things that had been carefully hidden for years beneath careless paperwork and hush money. When Sloane called her into his office and placed the new file in front of her, his voice sank in a way that was unusually grave. He told her that what he was about to say wouldn't be easy to hear. He said that the construction site where her father had worked back then had been ordered by Preston Vance to cut back on a series of safety measures in order to shorten the schedule and save costs. That necessary protective equipment had been removed, that warnings about the scaffolding's deterioration had been ignored, all so he could deliver the project on time and pocket an enormous profit. Her father and several other workers had once spoken up in protest, had warned that working under those conditions was far too dangerous, but the voices of those poor laborers had meant nothing against the greed of the man in power. And then, what had to happen finally happened. The accident came. Her father fell, not because of some random risk no one could have foreseen, but because human life had been deliberately treated as worthless from the beginning. Sloane went on, saying that after her father's death, Preston had quickly used money and power to shut down every investigation, bribe those who could testify, threaten anyone who dared open their mouth, and push a pitiful compensation payment onto the family so the whole matter could sink out of sight before anyone had time to recognize the truth. Rosalind sat listening, and with every word Sloane spoke, she felt the ground beneath her feet collapsing piece by piece. She remembered the image of her gentle father, the man who always came home with calloused hands and a tired but warm smile, the man who used to lift her onto his shoulders and promise that he would work hard so she and her little sister could have a better life. He hadn't died because of fate. He had been killed by the greed of a man who valued a human life less than a line of profit. And for all these years, she had lived inside a lie, carrying the pain of losing her father as if it had been an accident written by destiny, while the man truly responsible for that death had gone on feasting in luxurious hotels, still stretching out his powerful hand to trample weaker people like her father, and like her. A tremor ran through Rosalind's whole body, but this time it wasn't fear. It was an emotion she had never known she could hold, a deep, cold rage rising from the very bottom of her soul, mingling with the tearing grief of a daughter who had just learned the truth about her father's death. Tears fell from her eyes, but there was nothing weak in them. They shone with a new and unbending resolve. She lifted her gaze to Sloane, and in a voice soft but steady as steel, she said that man would have to pay for what he had done. Not with money, not with apologies, but with everything he had stolen from her father, and from so many others. For the first time since that night in the elevator, Rosalind was no longer the one running away. She was ready to turn back and face him, while Sloane's people continued digging deeper into the records of the accident from that year. One small detail buried among the old witness statements made even Sloane stop for a very long time. The notes said that on the day the accident happened, right before the scaffold collapsed, one worker hadn't thought of his own safety, but had rushed forward and pushed the young son of a fellow worker out of danger. The boy had happened to be at the construction site that day, waiting for his father to finish his shift. That worker had saved the child, but he himself hadn't managed to escape in time. And the name of that worker was Rosalind's father. Sloane sat motionless before the page, a strange feeling rising inside a chest that had gone too long without knowing how to tremble, because the boy who had been saved that year was the son of a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the early days of building his empire, a man Sloane regarded as a brother, and he had once heard that man speak through the haze of whiskey about the day his son had nearly died at a construction site, only to be saved by a stranger who had risked his life for him, a benefactor whose family they had never had the chance to find again, so they could say thank you. For so many years, that story had been only a blurred fragment of memory from old conversations, a debt of gratitude without a name or a face that his friend had carried in his heart. Now, sitting in the quiet room with the file in his hands, Sloane finally understood that the invisible thread had silently led him to the elevator doors that night, that the woman he had helped only because he hated those who preyed on the weak was, in fact, the daughter of the man who had saved the child his friend's entire family had always been grateful for. When he told Rosalind this, his voice was slower and softer than she had ever heard it, and she went still, her eyes still red from the tears she had shed for her father, blurring once more, but this time, from an emotion so warm and overwhelming it almost hurt. She realized that her father, even in the final moment of his life, had still been the man she had always believed in and been proud of. A man willing to trade his own life to save a child he didn't even know, and that the kindness he had planted that year, after so many years of seeming to sink into oblivion, had now grown into a branch that sheltered the very children he had left behind. Sloane said he didn't believe in fate or mystical things, but he couldn't deny that some debts of kindness moved quietly through the years in ways people never expected, and that helping her and Daisy, though it had begun only from his contempt for Preston Vance, had turned out to be his way of repaying a debt he had never known he carried. Rosalind softly said that perhaps her father had been watching over her from somewhere, and had sent Sloane to her on the very night she thought she had reached the end of the road, and Sloane didn't answer. He only looked at her with a rare tenderness in his eyes, a look no one in this city had ever seen in that cold man before. Between two people carrying wounds from the past, a quiet understanding had just begun to glow, needing few words, needing no display, only the sense that destiny had bound their lives together with a thread stronger than anything either of them could explain. And in that moment, the coming war with Preston Vance was no longer only revenge for a father. It had become an answer to every act of kindness that had ever been trampled, and to every powerless person who had ever been forgotten. When the pain had settled into a sharp resolve, Rosalind told Sloane that she didn't want to simply stand aside and watch him act on her behalf, that this was her father's fight, her own fight, and she wanted to help bring Preston Vance into the light with her own hands. Sloane looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He said his power could bring an empire crashing down, but there were certain doors that would only open for someone the enemy would never expect, and Rosalind was that person. She understood that her greatest advantage lay in the very position Preston had always looked down on, a server, a quiet shadow that powerful men like him never bothered to notice. She began by finding the workers who had once worked beside her father all those years ago, people who had been threatened by Preston so deeply that they had stayed silent for years, and she went from door to door, sat down to listen to their stories, and shared with them the loss her own family had carried too. At first, they were cautious and afraid, because the name Preston Vance was still a ghost haunting their lives. But when they saw the daughter of that worker from long ago standing before them with determined eyes, when they learned that this time they were no longer alone, that there was an entire force standing behind them to protect them, one by one, they began to open their hearts. An old worker, his hands trembling, took from the bottom of a cabinet an old notebook in which he had secretly recorded every safety violation at the construction site back then, things he had kept for years but had never dared give to anyone because he feared bringing trouble upon his family. Another man still had pay stubs and documents proving that Preston had forced workers to labor in dangerous conditions in order to cut costs. Rosalind patiently gathered every fragment, every testimony, recording the witnesses' stories with their consent, arranging all of it into a complete picture of the crime that had been buried. Then she did something even bolder. She used her own experience in event service to get a job at a function Preston would attend, putting on the familiar uniform, carrying trays of wine through the upper-class crowd like an invisible shadow, with no one recognizing that she was the same woman he had once chased through the hotel hallway that night. She quietly watched and listened to conversations Preston believed were safe among people on his side, and with a small recording device hidden in her apron, prepared for her by Sloane, she captured Preston's own voice, his arrogant words as he boasted to a business partner about how he always knew how to make problems disappear, how he used money to buy silence and power to choke off anyone who dared stand against him. Every sentence that slipped into the recording device was another brick pulled from the solid wall Preston had spent years building around himself. Rosalind returned each time with precious evidence, and each time, Sloane looked at her with a gaze mixed with admiration. He said he had met many powerful people in his life, but rarely had he seen anyone as brave as her, a woman with nothing in her hands walking straight into the tiger's den with only courage and a resolve that nothing could shake. But what made Rosalind proudest wasn't the evidence she had collected. It was the way the powerless people Preston had once crushed now stood up together, daring for the first time in years to believe that their voices could make a difference. She realized that true strength didn't lie in power or money, but in the unity of ordinary people, when they no longer agreed to bow their heads, and that if her father were still alive, he would surely be proud of the daughter who had chosen not to run, but to stand and demand justice, not only for him, but for everyone. But Preston Vance wasn't a man who had climbed to the peak of power without planting watchful ears everywhere. And before long, he caught the scent that someone was quietly digging up a matter he had believed buried long ago. When he traced it back and discovered that the person behind it was the server he had once chased through the hotel, and that she was also the daughter of the worker from all those years ago, his rage flared into a ruthless determination to crush her before everything slipped beyond his control. His counterblow came swiftly and viciously. First, he aimed at Rosalind's reputation. He used his connections in the media to spread filthy rumors about her, turning her from a daughter seeking justice for her father into an opportunist clinging to a powerful figure for personal gain and fabricating an old story in order to extort money. Those words spread quickly, and Rosalind realized with pain how easily a wealthy man could stain another person's name when he wanted to. Then he turned on the witnesses, the workers who had only just found the courage to speak, and a wave of fear came crashing back over their lives. The old worker who had given her the notebook suddenly called Rosalind in a trembling voice, saying he was sorry but he couldn't continue, that someone had come to see him, had reminded him of his family, of his grandchildren, and he couldn't trade the safety of his loved ones just to testify. Another man suddenly lost his job. Another received threats that forced him to pack up and leave the city. One witness after another withdrew. One piece after another that she had worked so hard to gather began to fall apart, and Preston's expensive lawyers started applying pressure, sending warning letters accusing her of slander, threatening to sue her into ruin if she dared open her mouth again. Rosalind felt the wall she had built with such care crumbling piece by piece before her eyes, and for the first time since deciding to stand up, she found herself surrounded by a heavy despair. One evening, she sat alone in the apartment after putting Daisy to sleep, staring at the stack of evidence that now held only half its value because the testimonies had been withdrawn, and her tears fell silently. She wondered whether she had been too naive to believe that a poor server like her could defeat a man who held an entire empire of money and power in his hands, whether she was dragging innocent people into danger because of a fight that belonged to her alone. She thought of the old worker's trembling face, of the families now forced to live in fear again because of her, and guilt pressed so heavily on her chest that she could barely breathe. In that moment of weakness, she almost wanted to give up, to gather everything together and take Daisy far away from this city, to start over somewhere the name Preston Vance couldn't reach. She called Sloane through her tears, telling him that perhaps she had been wrong, that she couldn't let more innocent people suffer because of her, that perhaps some evil men were born standing too high for anyone to touch. But on the other end of the line, Sloane only listened quietly as she cried. Then he said, in a calm, steady voice, that he was coming to her, and that she needed to remember one thing. A man striking back as wildly as Preston was now didn't do it because he was strong, but because for the first time in his life, he was truly afraid. And when a beast had begun to panic, that was exactly when it was most likely to make a fatal mistake. Sloane came to Rosalind's apartment that very night, and when he saw her tear-stained face and the scattered evidence before her, his gray eyes hardened into a kind of ice she had never seen before. He told her in a voice so calm it was chilling that Preston Vance had just made the greatest mistake of his life by thinking he could touch people under Sloane's protection, and that it was time for him to understand the price of doing so. From that moment on, a silent yet terrifying machine of power began to move, and Rosalind saw with her own eyes what the true strength of the man the entire city feared really looked like. Within only a few days, Preston's financial empire, which had once seemed unshakable, began to crack from its deepest veins. The massive loans he used to prop up his real estate projects were suddenly tightened by banks all at once. Longtime business partners turned their backs one after another and withdrew from joint deals without a word of explanation, and his accounts were frozen by surprise financial investigations that came crashing in from several directions at the same time. Sloane didn't need to lift a finger in the literal sense. He only had to make a few phone calls to the exact people who held the key links, send a few quiet messages through channels only insiders understood, and the entire web of power Preston had spent years building began to collapse like a sandcastle before the tide. Those who had once gathered around him to share in the benefits now scattered like birds before a storm, because no one wanted to sink with a ship already going under, and for the first time in many years, Preston Vance found himself growing more and more alone inside the very empire he had once believed untouchable. At the same time, Sloane didn't overlook the men who had threatened Rosalind's witnesses. He sent people to find every one of the hired hands who had gone around sowing fear among the workers' families, and through the overwhelming presence of Sloane's own men, those threats were quickly broken. Sloane's people didn't need violence. They only needed to make those men understand that now they were the ones being watched, that every move they made lay within the sight of a power far greater than their own, and that if they dared touch even a single hair on the heads of those witnesses, they would face consequences that none of Preston's money could protect them from. A quiet reversal spread through the city's underworld. Those who had once bowed under Preston's command now turned cautious at the name Sloane Ashford, and the witnesses who had been forced to withdraw in fear began to feel an invisible shield settling around them and their families. The old worker who had once called Rosalind in tears came to her again, this time with a new steadiness. He said someone had come to guarantee his family's safety, that he no longer had to live in fear, and that he was ready to testify again, this time all the way to the end. Rosalind watched the way Sloane wielded his power, both astonished and slowly understanding, and she realized that behind that cold ruthlessness was absolute control and an iron principle. He had never acted out of cruelty, but always to protect the people this world had turned its back on. When Preston realized who stood behind his downfall, he frantically tried to contact Sloane, but all he received in return was absolute silence, the terrifying silence of a wolf that had locked its prey in its sights and was only waiting for the final moment to close the hunt. When Preston's empire had cracked all the way down to its foundation, and the witnesses had found their courage again beneath Sloane's shield, Rosalind understood that the time had come to bring everything into the light. But this time, she and Sloane agreed on one thing. They wouldn't bring Preston down through hidden power or revenge in the shadows, but through the very scales of justice he had always believed his money could bend. Sloane used his connections not to bury Preston quietly, but to make sure the file of evidence reached the right people, people he couldn't buy, a federal investigative unit that handled financial crimes and serious workplace safety violations, people who stood beyond the reach of the local network Preston had spent so many years carefully cultivating. Rosalind personally gathered all the evidence together, the old worker's notebook, the pay stubs and documents proving the violations, the recordings of Preston's own arrogant admissions, along with the statements of the witnesses who were now ready to stand forward and face him to the end. She sat for hours in the federal investigator's office, calmly recounting the entire story, from her father's death many years earlier to everything she had uncovered, and this time, no power could silence her anymore. When the file was opened beneath the light of justice, every piece fit into place, forming an undeniable picture of a chain of crimes that had stretched across many years. And once the machinery of the law began to move, it was no longer something Preston's money could stop. At the same time, the truth was also brought before the public. The newspapers he had once used to smear Rosalind now turned their pens against him, exposing the true face of a man who had built his wealth on the lives and sweat of poor workers. The name Preston Vance, once spoken with respect in luxurious ballrooms, now became a symbol of greed and cruelty condemned by the entire city. And then, the day Rosalind had been waiting for finally arrived, when federal investigators appeared to arrest Preston in the middle of an event he was still attending, with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. The mask of a successful businessman fell away before the lenses of countless reporters, and for the first time, Rosalind saw that there was no arrogance left on the face of the man who had once chased her, only the panic and helplessness of someone who had just realized that everything he had built had collapsed, and that at last there was one thing his money and power couldn't buy: justice. She stood silently among the crowd, watching him being taken away, and inside her there wasn't the triumphant satisfaction she had once imagined. There was only a deep, quiet peace, a feeling that her father could finally rest, that his death and the deaths of so many other workers were no longer buried in silence and oblivion. The workers' families who had suffered under Preston's hand came to thank her through tears, and Rosalind understood that this victory didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to all the small, ordinary people who had dared to stand together, who had proven that no matter how powerful evil became, the truth and the courage of decent people could still prevail in the end. A few days after Preston was taken away, and the last waves of the case gradually began to settle, Rosalind went to Sloane's office, high above the city, the same place where she had once watched him open the locked chamber of his past. And this time she did not come as someone being protected, but as an equal who wanted to say everything still held inside her heart. She stood beside the glass window, looking down at the glittering city below, then turned to him and said she knew, she had always known, that he was the one who had quietly paid the hospital bills that saved Daisy's heart, that he had done it from the very beginning, when she still had nothing to give him in return, when she was still looking at him with eyes full of suspicion. Sloane was silent for a moment, and then he no longer denied it. He only said softly that he hadn't wanted her to feel indebted, that he hadn't helped Daisy in exchange for anything, but because when he looked at that child, he saw a part of his own childhood again, a child who had once wished there had been someone strong enough to protect the people he loved, yet couldn't. Rosalind stepped closer to him, and she said that all her life she had been used to carrying everything alone, used to relying on no one, but he was the first person who had made her understand that letting someone else step in and share the burden wasn't weakness. Sloane looked at her with gray eyes that no longer held any trace of ice, and he confessed something perhaps he had never said to anyone before, that in an entire life spent building walls around himself so no one could reach him, so he would never have to be weak again. She was the only crack in those walls, the only soft place he couldn't control. He said that on that night in the elevator, when he saw her shrinking into the corner, yet still lifting her head with eyes that refused to surrender, he had known she was different from everyone he had ever met, and that the more he stayed beside her, the more he realized he was slowly finding a part of himself he had thought he had lost long ago. The part that knew how to care, how to tremble, how to fear losing someone. Rosalind felt her eyes sting, because she understood that behind the man the whole city feared was a lonely soul who had not allowed himself to be loved for far too long, and she realized that between two people carrying wounds from the past, they had quietly healed each other in a way no beautiful promise ever could. She placed her hand over his, a simple gesture yet filled with everything that was too difficult to put into words, and she said she wasn't afraid of his walls, nor of the dark world he lived in, because she had seen the real man hidden behind that shell, a man who had used his power not to trample, but to lift up those who were weak, a man who had repaid a debt of kindness he had never known he carried, who had given her sister a new life, and given her faith that justice still existed in this world. Sloane took her hand, and in that moment, no more words were needed. Two people who had once believed their hearts had hardened against life had found in each other a place to return to, a peace they had both searched for across a long and weary stretch of years, and for the first time in many years, both Rosalind and Sloane felt that their hearts still held the full and unbroken ability to love. When all the storms had passed, Rosalind didn't choose to turn her back on the past and enjoy only her own new life. Instead, she decided to turn the pain she had once endured into something meaningful for other people. With Sloane's support, she founded a fund to help the families of workers who had been victims of those who treated human lives as worthless for the sake of profit. A fund named after her father, so that his name would no longer be tied to a forgotten death, but to hope and protection for the powerless. She went to each family, giving them not only material help, but also the belief that their voices deserved to be heard, that they weren't alone, and those who had once lived in fear and resignation now found in her both a support and an example of courage. Rosalind was no longer the quiet server carrying trays of wine through lavish rooms, but the greatest change in her wasn't her status or her circumstances. It was the way she stood with her back straight and her head held high, carrying within herself the dignity of someone who had walked through the deepest suffering without ever losing her kindness. Beside her was always Sloane, the man once known throughout the city for his cold ruthlessness, who had now found in her and Daisy a home he had never dared dream of. And in that small house filled with laughter, for the first time in years, he understood what it felt like to belong somewhere. On a sunny weekend afternoon, the three of them were together in the small garden behind the new house, and Daisy, now a healthy little girl full of life, ran joyfully among the rows of sunflowers she had once dreamed of, just like the picture she had drawn all those years ago. She laughed brightly as she showed her sister and Sloane her newest drawing, a picture of three people standing hand in hand before a house with a chimney and a garden full of flowers. And this time, the dream in that picture was no longer something far away, but a warm reality right before their eyes. Rosalind watched her sister laughing under the sunlight, looked at the man beside her as he smiled faintly, and silently thanked her father. Thanked the kindness he had planted in this life, a kindness that after so many years of seeming to be buried, had finally bloomed and sheltered the very children he had left behind. Rosalind's story reminds us that in this life, even when darkness sometimes seems to cover everything, a person's kindness and dignity are never meaningless, that every act of kindness we plant today may one day become a saving light for someone in the future, and that truth and courage, no matter how many hardships they must pass through, will always have a day when they are repaid as they deserve. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share it so that every day you can hear more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Rosalind and Sloane's journey? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear what you wish to send our way. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.